A friend of mine, let's call him Carlo, called me up recently about a sermon that he remembered me giving from like 5 years ago. He said it was about something I'd said to comfort a very frightened person who was dying in hospice. I had two reactions. The first one was this dopamine hit of pure vanity, like, I authored words so powerful that this guy still remembers them 5 years later? Yes. Look at you with your bad preaching self. And I gave me an internal high five while myself looked on and cheered, the three of us celebrating like some kind of idolatrous trinity. The other reaction, which followed immediately, went like this. Hang on a minute. I once told a panicked patient something that calmed their fear of dying? I have no recollection of this event at all, let alone preaching about it. I mean, like zero memory. And then I remembered the sermon Carlo was describing and realized the joke was on me, because what I had recounted was actually something that another pastor had said to a dying friend of my wife's. This friend, cancer, still in her early 40s, was literally in a fetal position in her hospital bed going, I don't want to die, I don't want to die, I don't want to die. And he took her hand and he looked her clear in the eye and he said to her, I don't know what's going to happen to you, but I do know that whatever happens, you are going to be okay. And her thirsty face just drank in his words, his tone, his demeanor, everything. She nodded like a little child, and she grew calm. Carlo had contacted me wanting to remember what it was that he mistakenly thought I had said, because his own father had just entered hospice. His Parkinson's had advanced to where he physically couldn't communicate much and was suffering hallucinations and confusion. Carlo wasn't sure, but he sensed that maybe his father was afraid. He wanted to know what to say to him. I know as Christians we're supposed to believe in heaven and all that, he told me, but the engineer in me just goes, but what if we die and that's just the end? He admitted that this idea of ceasing to exist terrifies him, even at times to the point of causing his heart to rattle and his breaths to go ragged with panic. There are times in my ministry that I feel utterly inadequate, utterly unable to muster any words or gestures sufficient to the moment's pastoral need. This was one of them. Part of the reason is because, in contrast to the chaplain my sermon had described, I just don't stand on a kind of solid bedrock of unwavering, literal-minded faith. I just don't. As anyone can attest who's ever seen me try to repair just about anything, I may not have an inner engineer, but there is a skeptic in residence who has a lot in common with Carlos. Also, truth be told, I resonated with his fear. Throughout my childhood and young adulthood, I too would experience occasional waves of terror at the thought that I would someday die and cease to exist. These could be so bad that at times I would rocket from my bed in the middle of the night and pace around my room to keep from hyperventilating. Tip of the hat to antidepressants. I admitted all this to Carlo. I said that I didn't think I could ever pull off the kind of conviction that enabled that pastor to say what he said to my wife's dying friend. Carlo and I talked about what we know and don't know, about how after death, our cells get remetabolized into other life forms, about the fact that we are made from the endlessly recycling atoms of stars. We marveled at the incomprehensible mystery of consciousness and discussed why we apply the word God to this wonder. We also talked about more tangible things. The disorientation of having a parent's personhood seem to disappear from their living body. The torture of seeing them confused, mute, vulnerable. I really do believe that God had given the pastor in my sermon the right words to say to my wife's friend, and that I would struggle to muster such conviction. But there's another reason I would hesitate to assert my beliefs in the way that he had. And I shared those with Carlo as well. The risk is that laying my convictions over the patient's fears could leave them feeling even more alone in that darkest place. In other words, it might convey an unwillingness to sit with someone in their actual suffering, to name and acknowledge and accept what is happening emotionally, to stay present, to not turn away, to accompany someone else in what they are going through, the spiritual courage not to abandon them in it, but to face it alongside them. I suspect, I told Carlo, that in the end, your authentic, open presence, your willingness not to leave your dad alone in his final journey is the most important thing. Yeah, he said, that's true for me too. I know I don't want to die alone. The whole conversation made me think of this song by singer-songwriter Carrie Newcomer called I'll Go Too. The song describes her childhood memory at night of fleeing ugly things under her bed into her father's easy chair in the living room. After a bit, he tells her it's time to go back to bed, but he takes her hand and promises, I'll go too. In the next verse, she's learning to swim. He tells her to grab his hand and they'll jump together. I'll go too. Next, she's a bride, not sure she can make it down the aisle. And he says, just do your best. I'll go too. In the final stanza, her mother's dying, and it's time to let her go. And this time she takes her father's hand and says, I know, I'll go too. The refrain goes, I'll go too, I'll go too. That's what he'd say. That's what he'd do. Don't go alone. I'll walk with you. I'll go too. That's the gift we can offer one another. The gift through which I believe God reaches us. The gift of accompanying. The gift of presence. You may have to go through it, but you don't have to go through it alone. I'll go too. And ultimately, that's the message of our faith's doctrine of incarnation flowing toward us in Paul's singing prose in Philippians 2. Here, Paul ties human love and sharing and compassion and sympathy with God's choice to enter time as Jesus. Jesus, who didn't exploit his equality with God, but emptied himself and humbled himself, taking human form and becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. In other words, God became fully human, suffered every human experience, even died on a cross. Why? Out of solidarity and love for us, out of willingness to walk every tortured path we humans must walk. Jesus' earthly journey and death is God's way of saying to us, I'll go too. As for Carlo, I confess that I hung up not feeling I was particularly helpful to him. I didn't convey a deep conviction in the afterlife on which he, in his moment of doubt, could lean. I certainly didn't offer him any specific words he could authentically voice to his dying father. A few minutes after our conversation, though, he texted me. It was great to hear your voice and your thoughts and your honesty, he wrote. I feel much better. And it occurred to me that, as inadequate as it felt, I'd given Carlos some taste of the kind of presence that I advised him to offer his father. Listening, reflecting, being authentic, being with. He had called me with fear about a hard experience he was facing. And in some way I had said back to him, I'll go too. Amen.